Chibis. I'm Ivy, and today we're talking about the hidden mechanics of recovery after sustained psychological abuse. If you enjoy stories like this, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Let's go! When a physical catastrophe occurs, the evidence remains visible in shattered glass, marked boundaries, and public sympathy. Yet, when an abusive relationship ends, the wreckage is largely internal, leaving an individual to navigate profound disruption without an official record of what was destroyed. The human nervous system does not process prolonged psychological manipulation as a simple relational dispute. Instead, it registers the aftermath as a persistent state of unresolvable threat, leaving survivors suspended between the relief of escape and the disorientation of profound deprivation. This documentary examines the hidden mechanics of recovery following sustained psychological abuse. We will explore why conventional models of bereavement often fail to describe this experience, how ambiguous loss alters autobiographical identity, and what empirical psychology reveals about rebuilding stability without relying on rigid timelines or manufactured milestones. Act 1. The inventory of invisible deprivation. When society evaluates the conclusion of a partnership, it typically measures tangible markers like shared assets, domestic arrangements, or custody agreements. In the context of chronic psychological abuse, however, the most severe damage occurs in domains that resist quantification. Long before any physical departure occurs, individuals experience an erosion of temporal agency, which is the subjective sense of owning one's future and making uncoerced choices. Family researcher Pauline Boss formulated the theory of ambiguous loss to describe situations where loss lacks definitive physical boundaries or societal closure. In one primary category of ambiguous loss, an individual is physically present in one's environment or routine, yet psychologically absent or hostile as a source of safety and reciprocal care. In coercive environments, survivors mourn the living, continually reconciling the reality of a partner, parent, or colleague with the profound absence of emotional safety. This dynamic extracts a heavy temporal cost. Individuals often mourn the lost opportunities of their developmental or professional years, from foreclosed career ambitions to postponed personal goals. A person emerging from years of domestic control does not simply mourn the dissolved union. They grieve the life they were prevented from constructing during that period, an intangible subtraction that leaves no physical artifact behind. Act 2. The architecture of disenfranchised mourning. Standard bereavement comes with established social scaffolding. Funerals, bereavement leave, and communal rituals provide a recognized container for sorrow. When a relationship dissolves due to psychological control or coercive manipulation, the surrounding culture often expects immediate celebration or uncomplicated relief. Thanatologist Kenneth Docker introduced the term disenfranchised grief to describe losses that cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly shared. Because coercive control often leaves no visible bruising, and because manipulative dynamics are easily masked in public settings, survivors frequently encounter skepticism or well-meaning minimization from their social circles. Phrases suggesting that one should simply move on or celebrate newfound freedom inadvertently delegitimize the complex mourning taking place. Furthermore, psychiatric classification systems such as the International Classification of Diseases distinguish normal grief from clinical depressive episodes and stress-related disorders. In uncomplicated bereavement, self-worth is typically preserved even amid intense sorrow. In the wake of prolonged psychological abuse, however, loss is deeply entangled with shame, self-blame, and chronic hyperarousal. When the social environment denies validation to these overlapping states, the nervous system remains on defensive alert, prolonging distress in an atmosphere of isolation. Act 3. The oscillation of recovery. Popular culture frequently misapplies early psychological frameworks, suggesting that healing follows a neat sequence of stages, leading inevitably from denial to acceptance. Contemporary grief science has largely abandoned these linear trajectories. Research led by Margaret Strobe and Henk Schutt demonstrates that healthy adaptation relies on a dual process model, an ongoing oscillation between loss-oriented coping and restoration-oriented coping. On some days, loss-oriented processing dominates, The survivor feels the full weight of anger, memory, and cognitive dissonance, confronting the stark reality of how much energy was expended managing an unsafe environment. On other days, restoration-oriented tasks take precedence, focusing on mastering practical logistics, reorganizing living spaces, and developing new competencies. Movement between these states is not evidence of regression, but the normal mechanism by which the mind integrates profound disruption. It is equally important to acknowledge the findings of resilience researchers such as George Bonanno. A meaningful proportion of individuals navigate substantial relational trauma with natural emotional resilience, returning to baseline functioning without requiring years of intensive processing. Healing does not require an obligatory performance of lifelong suffering, nor does it demand adherence to arbitrary rules, such as mandatory 12-month periods of isolation. Recovery is idiosyncratic and deeply tied to an individual's unique social and economic reality. Act 4. Trauma bonding and the neurological paradox. One of the most disorienting aspects of post-abuse grief is the persistence of emotional longing alongside profound fear or resentment. Survivors often struggle with intense self-criticism when they catch themselves missing a person who caused them sustained distress. This cognitive note is not a character flaw, but a well-documented neurobiological consequence of intermittent reinforcement. Decades of behavioral research synthesized in clinical contexts by Donald Dutton and Susan Painter explain how alternating cycles of hostility and warmth create exceptionally durable attachment bonds. When an attachment figure is simultaneously the source of threat and the sole provider of comfort, the biological drive for safety becomes fused with a relational bond. When that bond is severed, the central nervous system undergoes a withdrawal process analogous to the cessation of a physical dependency. Judith Herman and subsequent trauma researchers have highlighted how prolonged interpersonal subjugation alters threat detection systems. The brain remains wired to anticipate the next unpredictable shift in mood or demand. When quiet finally arrives, the sudden absence of hypervigilance can feel unnerving rather than peaceful. Survivors must mourn not only what occurred, but also navigate the uncomfortable silence of a nervous system recalibrating to baseline safety. Act 5. Reconstructing the disrupted narrative. Because psychological manipulation systematically undermines trust in one's own perception, recovery requires more than simply expelling memories. It demands the reconstruction of autobiographical narrative coherence. In clinical practice, this involves distinguishing adaptive meaning-making from endless rumination. Rumination asks circular questions rooted in helplessness, focusing on why someone behaved with cruelty or how one failed to anticipate manipulation sooner. Narrative integration, by contrast, focuses on objective agency. It reframes the past not as an inherent defect in the survivor's judgment, but as an intelligible response to deceptive conditions. Research on self-compassion, particularly the operationalized frameworks developed by Christine Neff, indicates that responding to past vulnerability with common humanity and mindful validation significantly diminishes post-traumatic shame. Practical recovery also requires realistic environmental boundaries. While popular advice often insists on absolute disconnection, socioeconomic realities such as shared custody, complex legal proceedings, or workplace constraints may make complete separation impossible. In these circumstances, strategic communication protocols, structured contact schedules, and parallel engagement serve as necessary protective scaffolding. Boundaries are functional tools for safety, not moral tests of personal commitment. Act 6. Beyond forced closure. The cultural expectation of closure is often an illusion borrowed from narrative fiction. Deep interpersonal disruptions do not disappear on a fixed calendar date. Instead, they become integrated into a larger, more complex life history. True integration occurs when a person recognizes that their identity was never truly destroyed, but rather suppressed under the weight of sustained threat management. When energy is no longer consumed by threat detection, cognitive resources naturally reallocate toward genuine curiosities, values, and relational discernment. The objective is not to transform pain into an idealized narrative of spiritual growth, but to reclaim the right to live with authentic agency and physical safety. Survivors do not need to prove their healing by performing forgiveness, nor do they need to erase their history to demonstrate progress. By acknowledging ambiguous losses, respecting the nonlinear rhythm of their own nervous system, and rebuilding daily autonomy, individuals move out of prolonged emergency states and step back into authorship of their own lives. If you found value in this evidence-based examination of recovery and relational psychology, consider subscribing to the channel. Sharing this analysis with someone who may benefit from a grounded perspective helps broaden understanding around complex trauma and ambiguous loss.